I'm Neil Preece, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Dreaming of Chess Mastery, which looks at the world of adult chess improvement. One of the real challenges for all of us, beginner, adult chess improver, or for that matter, grandmaster, is deciding on what move to play. And I confess I often find myself in a position where I really have no idea what I'm supposed to do. And fortunately, there's a lot of help out there about how to go through this process, how to evaluate a position, look at structural features that will lead me towards a sensible plan, candidate moves, and help me to analyse what I should do next. And the suggestions of how to go about this are very, very sensible, and I think there's a broad consensus amongst a lot of different coaches and sources of advice in this regard as to at least the common features of how you go about doing this. There are differences, of course, stylistic differences and some deeper philosophical ones, but in general, the suggestions are broadly the same. And if I go back to when I was the sort of advice I received when I was a beginner, one of the things that we were all told to do is sit on your hands. First ask yourself what your opponent's move is threatening, decide if it's something serious, and then decide what you're going to do. But sit on your hands and consider their move first. And this remains very good advice. Before I decide on some sort of active plan, I need to consider if there's an urgent threat that requires my attention. And then, once I've eliminated that sort of element of the decision-making process, and I'm looking at a more general evaluation and sort of strategic appraisal of what I'm going to do and what plan to follow, there are, again, as I say, there are broad sorts of guidelines. You look at the material balance, look at your king safety, look at structural features, pawn structures, look at the dynamic considerations, the activity of your pieces, and so on. But this sort of begs a question. If one frequently finds oneself quite lost in the game, and I think this is probably true of many of us, and not just because we're weak chess players, but because chess is a difficult, confusing game. We will frequently find ourselves in positions where there's not something obvious to do, and the plan that we have isn't some sort of long-term Capablanca-esque master plan that is unfolding. One, because many positions aren't like that, and obviously also because I'm not, and nor are you, Capablanca. We are not capable, perhaps, of making such far-reaching and deep plans. And for that matter, when Capablanca was asked how far ahead does he look in a position, he said, one move. So all of that begs an important question. If we're going to do these kind of careful, structured analyses of our position, evaluations before deciding on a move, well, that's all very well if you're a correspondence chess player. But if you're playing even a classical game, 90 minutes with a 30-second increment. Even if you have 4 hours for 40 moves between you and your opponent's thinking time, to do this kind of analysis is time-consuming, and frankly, you don't have the time available. So, what then? Well, I suppose the natural answer is, most of the time, that probably isn't necessary, or at least much of the time. Many of your moves will be fairly straightforward, simple recaptures or follow-ups to your previous move. So that will help you along the way. But one of my favourite chess writers, Jonathan Tisdall, author of the quite fantastic book Improve Your Chess Now, I've mentioned it before. It is a slightly unfortunate title, but I think it's certainly not one where he should be held to account, a false promise. It's a book packed full of practical advice. And he suggests a good point, that actually what we need to do is do this rather like we were when we were beginners, when our coach might have said, or the adult advising you, coach is probably too impressive a word, certainly in my case. So the people giving me advice, sit on your hands and ask yourself what your opponent's threatening. Sit on your hands and evaluate the position as quickly as you can. Many of the features won't change, but do it religiously. And I think Tisdall's kind of his general point at a certain stage in the book is that at the beginning, do this religiously. Do this every time until it becomes a sort of default habit ingrained in your mind, something that becomes a sort of subconscious backdrop to your decision-making process. A bit like as a child, again, this is a bit of a forced example. I remember we were members of a strange thing called the Tufty Club. I suppose I was 6, or I was in England. And the Tufty Club was this little squirrel that gave you advice about all sorts of important things, like crossing the road, holding your mother's hand, and look left, look right, look left again, which works in England, is probably not the right advice here in Brazil. But, eventually ideas about brushing your teeth, or how to cross the road, or security precautions when you're using your hot plate, these become second nature. But at first you need to consciously think about them and make it sort of almost mantra driven until you have established a sort of thinking habit. And I think that's something that I need to do at the moment, because I've realised in my first few rapid chess games that my thinking is, well, it's a mess. And actually I see it in the puzzles that I'm solving. I'm working from the woodpecker method as sort of a book-driven tactical training process. But I also, first thing in the morning, do 3 puzzles on chess.com, my sort of free allowance. And they can be quite challenging. And I find myself very often establishing 2 or 3 obvious candidate moves. And sometimes I'm wrong in that too. But let us just imagine that there's a choice of two moves that I can make at the starting position. And I flip between these two candidate moves rather than analysing the most promising one, analysing it as deeply as I can, and then looking at the second. So that kind of disciplined thought needs to become a habit for me. And it clearly plagues my rapid chess games. And it is an inefficient way of thinking. So developing a sort of protocol, carry out a sort of threefold step process. Number one, look at what my opponent is threatening or what has changed by their move. Quickly evaluate the position, and then develop a set of candidate moves that I'm going to analyse. And it strikes me that this kind of analytical approach to decision making, I've mentioned how there are parallels in how we make other sorts of decisions in our life. But rather like those situations, at critical moments we perhaps need to stop and do a bit of a deep dive in the evaluation process. And on an everyday basic decision-making moment in our day, we need to do a brief evaluation, or it may even be something that is almost subconscious. But I think there's a real carryover in creating a disciplined approach to how we choose a chess move, to how we make other decisions in our lives. And perhaps, as is so often the case, I find myself thinking, if my thinking is so haphazard in something as structured as a game of chess, what about in other aspects of my life? And that's a little more worrying, frankly. Anyway, the positive side is if I can develop a more structured process to decision-making in chess, perhaps that will spin over into much more critical choices that I'm having to make from time to time. That's it for this week. I trust you're enjoying your chess, that your lives are filled with joy, and until next week, from sunny Brazil, ciao.